Abraham Lincoln was born on February 12, 1809. He spent his first years in a log cabin in rural Kentucky. His mother's death when he was 9 years old deeply affected him and put more tension on his strained relationship with his father.
Abraham Lincoln rarely spoke about his mother. For a man who became one of the most quoted, most documented, most thoroughly biographied figures in American history, this silence stands out as a genuine and lasting historical puzzle, not because of any hidden genetic secret, but because of what we can actually verify: a tangle of frontier rumor, social stigma, incomplete records, and one deeply revealing conversation between Lincoln and his law partner that historians have argued over for more than 150 years. Nancy Hanks Lincoln was born around 1784, almost certainly somewhere in Virginia, though even that basic fact is not settled with certainty in the historical record. She married Thomas Lincoln in 1806 in Washington County, Kentucky, and the couple eventually settled in a one-room log cabin near Hodgenville, Kentucky, where Abraham was born on February 12, 1809. The family later moved to Indiana when Abraham was 7 years old, part of the restless westward migration common to thousands of frontier families of the period. Nancy died on October 5, 1818, when Abraham was only 9 years old. The cause of death was milk sickness, a real and genuinely terrifying ailment of the era caused by drinking milk or eating meat from cattle that had grazed on white snakeroot, a toxic plant common in the wooded regions of the Midwest. The poison, now known as trematol, caused trembling, vomiting, and often death, and it killed not only Nancy but several other settlers in the same small Indiana community within weeks of one another. What makes Nancy Hanks historically elusive is not mystery for mystery's sake, but a genuine scarcity of documentation. She left behind no letters, no diary entries, no portraits, and only a handful of second-hand recollections from neighbors and relatives who were interviewed decades after her death, primarily by Lincoln's law partner and eventual biographer, William Herndon. Herndon conducted extensive interviews with people who had known the Lincoln family in Kentucky and Indiana, and these interviews remain the primary, and frequently unreliable, source for almost everything we think we know about Nancy's personality and origins. Memories that are recorded 40 or 50 years after the fact, from elderly frontier residents recalling a woman who died when they themselves were children or young adults, are inherently shaky as historical evidence, and professional historians have long cautioned against treating Herndon's collected reminiscences as solid fact rather than folklore colored by time. The central controversy surrounding Nancy's origins concerns her parentage. The widely repeated claim, which appears in Herndon's records and which Lincoln himself apparently believed, was that Nancy was illegitimate, born out of wedlock to a woman named Lucy Hanks. According to the most common version of this account, Lucy Hanks was an unmarried woman in Virginia who later married Henry Sparrow after relocating to Kentucky, and Nancy was raised partly by relatives, including Lucy's sister and brother-in-law, Elizabeth and Thomas Sparrow. The identity of Nancy's biological father has never been conclusively established. Various theories proposed over the decades have named different Virginia men, but none of these claims rest on documentary proof. No birth record, no court record, no contemporary letter confirms paternity. This is not unusual for the period. Record-keeping for poor, rural families in late 18th century Virginia and Kentucky was inconsistent at best, and illegitimate births were, understandably, not the kind of event families rushed to formalize in writing. What we do have, and what makes this story genuinely compelling without needing any invented science, is Lincoln's own documented reaction to this rumor. William Herndon recorded that Lincoln once told him, during a private conversation, that he believed his mother was the illegitimate daughter of a well-bred Virginia farmer or planter. This statement, whether accurate or simply something Lincoln had absorbed from family rumor, reveals something genuinely significant about how Lincoln understood himself and his own background. In the rigid social hierarchies of 19th century America, illegitimacy carried real and lasting stigma. For a self-made man building a political career on the strength of his own character and intellect, having an illegitimate mother was a vulnerability that contemporaries and political opponents could and did exploit. Frontier gossip about the Hanks family's reputation followed Lincoln throughout his early life and into his political career, and some of his contemporaries did use insinuations about his mother's background as a tool of political insult, which was a common and ugly tactic in 19th-century American politics generally. This context helps explain Lincoln's documented reticence on the subject. When campaign biographers approached him in 1860 seeking material for the kind of detailed family history that voters of the era expected from presidential candidates, Lincoln offered remarkably little. He is famously quoted as summarizing his origins with a line borrowed from Thomas Gray's elegy written in a country churchyard, describing his early life as containing only the short and simple annals of the poor. This was, by most historical interpretations, less an admission of shame and more a calculated piece of political self-presentation. Lincoln understood that his campaign biography needed a clean, simple, sympathetic narrative of humble origins and self-made success. The now famous rail-splitter image, and the complicated, potentially scandalous details of his mother's parentage simply did not serve that narrative. Whatever personal feelings he held about Nancy's background, the political incentive to avoid the topic was significant and well documented by historians studying his 1860 campaign. It's also worth noting what Lincoln did say about his mother, because it complicates any narrative of pure shame or rejection. He is reported to have called her his angel mother and credited her with whatever intellectual qualities he believed he possessed. This affectionate, almost reverent language toward Nancy, recorded by people who knew Lincoln personally, sits in genuine tension with his reluctance to discuss her origins publicly. And that tension itself is the real historical mystery, not some hidden genetic secret. It suggests a man who loved and idealized his mother's memory while simultaneously feeling the social vulnerability that her uncertain parentage represented in a status-conscious era. Historians have also pointed to Lincoln's documented struggles with depression, what his contemporaries called melancholy, as part of the broader picture of his psychology, though responsible historians are careful not to draw direct causal lines between his mother's social background and his mental health. Lincoln's depressive episodes are well attested by people who knew him throughout his life, including before his political career and the pressures of the Civil War, and there has been extensive serious historical and even modern clinical speculation about the roots of this melancholy. But that speculation properly belongs in the realm of documented psychological history and biographical analysis, not in unverified genetic claims about ancient migration patterns. As for Lincoln's notable height and physical features, he stood approximately 6 feet 4 inches tall in an era when the average American man was several inches shorter. This is genuinely documented and visually confirmed by numerous photographs and first-hand accounts. Medical historians have long speculated about possible explanations, including the genuine and well-studied hypothesis that Lincoln may have had Marfan syndrome, a connective tissue disorder that can produce unusually tall stature, long limbs, and the kind of gaunt facial structure visible in Lincoln's photographs. This theory has been seriously discussed in peer-reviewed medical literature for decades, including analysis by geneticists studying Marfan syndrome's hereditary patterns. It remains an unconfirmed but scientifically grounded hypothesis, distinct from any claims about exotic ancestral origins. The deeper reason Nancy Hanks remains a subject of fascination is that she represents something quite common in American genealogical history, an ordinary person whose life left almost no paper trail, who existed and mattered enormously to the people who knew her, and about whom we are left to reconstruct a picture from fragments, rumors, and the often unreliable memories of others. This is true of the vast majority of women on the American frontier in this period. Literacy was not universal, record-keeping was inconsistent, and women in particular were frequently undocumented except through their relationships to fathers, husbands, and sons. Nancy Hanks Lincoln is unusual only because her son became one of the most consequential figures in American history, which means that genealogists, historians, and amateur researchers have spent enormous effort trying to fill in gaps that, for almost any other frontier woman of the era, would simply remain permanently blank. Modern genealogical DNA research has indeed become a powerful tool for resolving certain kinds of historical mysteries, confirming or ruling out specific ancestral claims, identifying biological relationships that paper records cannot settle, and occasionally overturning long-accepted historical assumptions. Organizations like the Hanks Family DNA Projects, which do genuinely exist as collaborative genealogical research efforts among descendants trying to map family trees through Y-DNA and mitochondrial DNA testing, represent legitimate ongoing work in this field. However, no verified, peer-reviewed scientific study has produced confirmed mitochondrial DNA sequencing directly from Nancy Hanks Lincoln's remains, nor has any legitimate genetic research establishment published findings about her specific haplogroup or any claims about exotic ancestral origins tied to ancient transoceanic migrations. Her gravesite near Lincoln City, Indiana, has been preserved and marked since the 1870s. But excavation and genetic testing of presidential family remains involves significant ethical, legal, and practical barriers that have not, to date, been crossed for this purpose. What remains genuinely true, well-documented, and fascinating about Nancy Hanks Lincoln is this: she was a woman born into genealogical uncertainty in a deeply status-conscious era. She raised a son who would go on to preserve the United States through its most severe crisis. She died young from an entirely preventable frontier illness, and her son carried complicated, partially documented feelings about her memory and origins for the rest of his life, feelings significant enough that he addressed them, however briefly, in private conversation with his closest professional confidant. The real story of Nancy Hanks doesn't require invented genetic revelations to be compelling. It is, instead, a window into the genuine social anxieties of 19th-century America, the limitations of historical record-keeping for ordinary people, and the complicated inner life of a president who spent his public career carefully curating which parts of his personal history the world was allowed to see. Lincoln went to his grave in 1865 without ever fully resolving the questions surrounding his mother's birth, and so, in the most factual sense, do we. What we have instead is a rich and well-documented historical mystery, one rooted in real social history, real frontier hardship, and real human complexity, rather than a manufactured scientific revelation. Sometimes the most honest answer history can offer is uncertainty itself, and in Nancy Hanks Lincoln's case, that uncertainty tells us as much about the world Abraham Lincoln came from as any confirmed fact could.